Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving into a moment that could truly reshape the future of a devastating conflict. We're focusing on the Israel-Gaza ceasefire negotiations, specifically what's happening right now, July 2nd, 2025. This isn't just, another headline summary. We're aiming to peel back the layers, give you real clarity on the demands, the counter demands, and crucially, the immense human stakes involved.
Absolutely. Our mission here is to cut through some of that noise. We want to get to the core of why this moment feels, well, potentially different, and also why a lasting resolution is just so incredibly challenging. We'll go beyond the surface level.
Right. The goal is for you to walk away really well informed, understanding the critical details that often get missed. So let's start with most striking news. The headline today, July 2nd. Hamas has apparently signaled its readiness for a ceasefire. Now, we've heard signals before. What makes this one significant? Does it feel genuinely different this time around?
Well, that's the key question, isn't it? On one hand, any signal towards stopping the fighting is a flicker of hope, definitely. But the real weight here, the thing that makes it different, is Hamas's absolutely unequivocal condition. They've stated very clearly this ceasefire must lead to a complete permanent end to the war.
Ah, okay, so not just a pause.
Exactly. Not a temporary truce for regrouping, which is, often the fear. They're demanding a final stop to hostilities. That's been the major hurdle historically.
And then we have the other side of the equation. There's a U.S. proposal on the table presented under President Trump. It proposes a 60-day ceasefire, and reports say Israel has agreed to these terms. Can you walk us through what that actually involves, especially the exchange part?
Sure. The U.S. proposal lays out a structured exchange intended to facilitate that 60-day pause. It centers on releasing half the hostages Hamas holds. The reports, tragically, suggest this means about 10 living hostages and the remains of 18 deceased ones. And in return for that, Palestinian prisoners held by Israel would be released, along with remains Israel holds. It's a phased swap.
Okay, a direct phased exchange.
Right. And what's fascinating, or perhaps telling, is how this proposal tries to navigate the failures of the past. You remember, right, the 4-day ceasefire back in November 2023. It held briefly, was extended, but then collapsed. Or that 3-phase deal proposed in January 2025. There was some initial agreement, but it fell apart by March when the fighting picked back up.
Right, those didn't stick.
No. And they faltered, largely because a temporary pause didn't guarantee the permanent end Hamas wanted, or Israel didn't feel its core security goals were met. So this new 60-day plan, with its specific exchange, is an attempt to build maybe enough momentum, enough incentive to hold. But
those fundamental disagreements are still there?
Precisely. The underlying, deeply entrenched demands haven't gone away.
Which brings us right to it. Here's where it gets really interesting, or maybe really difficult. The fundamental deadlock. Even with this new proposal, what are the absolute non-negotiables keeping things stuck?
Yet this is the heart of the complexity. It's more than just haggling over details. It's a clash of, well, fundamental fears and visions for the future. Look, Hamas's position, voiced by their spokesperson Tahir al-Nunu, remains firm on one critical point. He said they are ready and serious, but only for an initiative that clearly leads to the complete end to the war.
Ready and serious, but only if it means a permanent end.
Exactly. And it's not just talk. It's this deep-seated insistence on a permanent cessation and a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Their reluctance stems from history, They fear a temporary ceasefire just gives Israel time to regroup and then resume fighting, maybe even more intensely. They've seen truces break down before.
So for them, a pause without a guaranteed end isn't a real step forward.
It's seen as potentially just delaying the inevitable, possibly under worse conditions for them.
And that position crashes right into Israel's stance, doesn't it? Led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has consistently refused a permanent end to the war. Israel demands Hamas be dismantled, exiled even. It's framed as essential for their security.
Absolutely. It's a stark contrast. For Israel, particularly after the events that sparked this latest round of intense conflict, the goal is framed in terms of national survival. Security for them means removing Hamas as a governing and military force. Preventing future attacks is paramount.
So it seems like an irreconcilable difference at the core.
It really does. And this raises a crucial point, I think. What we're seeing is that they aren't just negotiating terms of a ceasefire. They're essentially negotiating completely different definitions of what victory or even just resolution looks like. And those definitions are, right now, mutually exclusive.
How so?
Well, for Israel, resolution means the absence of Hamas as a threat. Eradication. For Hamas, resolution means the end of the conflict and the occupation, validating their resistance. These aren't just competing goals. They're fundamentally incompatible visions for Gaza's future and for their own security. It makes finding common ground incredibly difficult.
It's like that analogy you sometimes hear.
Yeah, it really is like a high-stakes poker game. But the chips are human lives, thousands of them. Both sides feel they absolutely cannot fold on these core demands. Any concession feels like total defeat.
And adding another layer, we have President Trump directly involved, reportedly pushing Hamas to accept this specific deal, a very public intervention.
Yes, adding external pressure from a major player.
Amidst all this political maneuvering, these high-stakes negotiations, it's vital we don't lose sight of the reason this is so urgent, the human cost. Can you just remind us of the scale of the humanitarian crisis right now in Gaza?
It's crucial. The numbers are just devastating, and it's hard to even comprehend them sometimes. We're talking over 56,000 deaths reported from Gaza. What's truly heartbreaking is that over half of those reported killed are women and children. These aren't just numbers, they're families destroyed.
56,000 lives. It's staggering.
It is. And beyond the deaths, you have the displacement. An estimated 90%, 9 out of 10 people in Gaza's 2.3 million population have been forced from their homes.
90%. Where do they even go?
That's the thing. They're living in makeshift shelters, overcrowded conditions, often without the most basic necessities. Imagine your entire city, almost everyone you know, suddenly homeless. And the conditions themselves are just dire. Infrastructure, homes, hospitals, schools is largely in ruins. This means severe shortages of everything. Food, clean water, medical supplies, fuel. It's complete breakdown of normal life.
And aid getting in is difficult.
Extremely difficult. International aid organizations are on the ground doing heroic work, but they face immense struggles. The ongoing fighting, the destruction, the logistical nightmare. Delivering aid consistently and distributing it safely is incredibly dangerous and challenging. The sheer scale of the need is overwhelming. It's a constant state of crisis and uncertainty for millions.
Hearing that really underscores the moral weight, doesn't it? Beyond the politics and the military objectives, there's just this incredible human desperation. It makes finding a way to stop the fighting feel like an absolute imperative.
Absolutely. It puts all the diplomatic efforts into sharp relief. These aren't abstract negotiations. They directly impact the survival and dignity of millions of people every single day.
So let's talk about this diplomatic efforts. The mediators, Egypt and Qatar, are constantly mentioned. Why them? What makes their role so critical here?
Egypt and Qatar are really central to this whole process, and for specific reasons. Egypt, shares a border with Gaza. They have deep historical ties and lines of communication with both Israelis and Palestinians. They often play a very pragmatic intermediary role.
Okay, geographic proximity and history. And Qatar.
Qatar's influence comes from a different angle. They maintain direct contact with Hamas's political leadership, which is crucial when direct talks between Hamas and Israel aren't happening. So they act as essential conduits for messages, for conveying proposals and responses.
But mediating between two sides with such deep mistrust and diametrically opposed goals must be incredibly challenging.
Immense challenges. They're not just relaying messages. They're trying to interpret positions, identify potential areas of flexibility, however small, and navigate intense internal politics on both sides. They're constantly searching for that tiny sliver of common ground in a landscape defined by conflict and suspicion. It's a thankless, painstaking task.
And that task is front and center today, July 2nd. There's a crucial meeting scheduled in Cairo. A Hamas delegation is meeting with Egyptian and Qatari mediators to discuss this U.S. proposal, right? To get clarifications before responding.
That's correct. This meeting is pivotal. Hamas wants to understand the nuances, the guarantees or lack thereof, particularly regarding that permanent end to the war. Their response hinges on these clarifications.
So a lot rests on what happens in Cairo today.
Absolutely. And if you step back and connect this to the bigger picture, you see the wider international context. The U.S. is pushing hard as Israel's key ally. But other players matter too. European nations, other Middle Eastern countries, they're largely aligned in calling for peace, for regional stability. They have stakes in this too.
And the outcome reflects on U.S. diplomacy under Trump as well, I imagine?
Definitely. A successful ceasefire, even temporary, could be seen as a diplomatic win. A failure reinforces perceptions of intractability and, perhaps, the limits of U.S. influence in this specific dynamic. So everyone's watching Cairo, not just for the immediate next step, but for what it signals about the potential for de-escalation more broadly. The mediators are really trying to thread an incredibly fine needle.
Okay, so looking ahead then, given everything we've discussed, the proposal, the sticking points, the mediation, What does this all mean for what comes next? These next few days feel critical. What are the potential scenarios coming out of today's meeting?
Well, fundamentally, it feels quite binary, quite stark. If Hamas, after getting clarifications, accepts the proposal, even with reservations, that could genuinely open a new chapter. It would mean a pause in the fighting, the return of some hostages, some prisoners released.
Yeah.
It could potentially create space for more substantial talks down the line, though that's a big if.
And the alternative, if they reject it.
If it's rejected, particularly if the rejection is firm based on that permanence demand, the most likely immediate outcome is, unfortunately, a resumption or continuation of intense hostilities, which means, tragically, more destruction and more suffering on the ground in Gaza.
So the path forward seems to require significant compromise, which we've established is incredibly hard to achieve here.
It's the core dilemma. For any progress, Hamas would likely need to view a temporary ceasefire not as the end goal, but perhaps as a strategic step, a way to pause the devastation and maybe test intentions.
And Israel?
And Israel would need to offer something tangible regarding Palestinian security concerns, something that goes beyond just a pause before potentially resuming operations, a move towards genuine de-escalation.
But bridging that gap, building that trust, it seems almost insurmountable given the history.
That's the immense challenge, isn't it? You're talking about decades of conflict, cycles of violence, broken agreements, and profound, deep-seated mistrust. Trust isn't built overnight, especially not in this context. It requires verifiable steps, consistent actions, maybe even taking risks.
Risks that both sides seem extremely unwilling to take right now.
Understandably so, from their perspectives, perhaps. Each side views the other through the lens of past trauma and future threat. Overcoming that requires an extraordinary shift, a leap of faith that seems, frankly, very difficult in the current climate.
So to recap, we have this flicker of hope Hamas signaling readiness, but it's heavily conditional on a permanent end to the war. This clashes head-on with Israel's security demands and refusal of that permanence, and it's all playing out through these intense mediation efforts, especially today in Cairo. Cautious optimism meets harsh reality.
Exactly. The world is watching, hoping for a breakthrough, maybe even a miracle. The people in Gaza desperately need peace, and Israelis desperately seek security. These are fundamental human needs. But while a resolution isn't impossible, the sheer controversy around the terms, the depth of mistrust, and the ghosts of past failures, they all caution against any easy optimism right now. As we wait for news from Cairo, maybe the thing to consider is this. What does it truly take for adversaries this entrenched, with this much history, to find common ground? Not just for a pause, but for something lasting. It likely demands more than just compromise on terms. It probably requires redefining what victory even means, reimagining security, and maybe the hardest part, acknowledging the other side's fears and vulnerabilities, even while facing your own.